You know the name, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson. For millions of us, he's the face of modern science. He's charismatic, brilliant, and our go-to guide to the cosmos. But today, we're not looking at the stars. We're looking at the philosophy behind the science communicator. And this explainer is all about breaking down a critical analysis of that very worldview.
I'm sure you've heard this famous quote, and it is powerful, it's humbling, and it really captures a core part of the scientific mindset. Reality is what it is, whether we like it or not. It kind of sets the stage for a purely objective look at the universe.
But, that quote also opens up a much bigger question, one that our source material really dives into. When you peel back the layers of physics and astronomy, what philosophical assumptions are sitting there underneath? What's the framework being used to interpret all the scientific facts? Well, that is exactly what we're here to explore.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this critique, we first need to get a handle on two key philosophical terms. The analysis argues that these isms are these powerful and often unstated undercurrents that really shape a lot of what Tyson communicates to the public.
All right, first up, scientism. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand. The source isn't critiquing science. Science is an incredibly powerful method. Scientism, on the other hand, is a philosophical belief about science. It's the belief that science is the only valid path to any real truth.
And this toolbox analogy, it makes the whole thing crystal clear. Think of science as a toolbox, right? It's filled with amazing tools for understanding the physical world. Hammers, saws, you name it. Scientism is the belief that this is the only toolbox that exists. It's like insisting you have to use a hammer to write a poem. The source argues this stretches science's authority way beyond its proper domain, into areas like ethics and meaning, where its tools, well, they just don't apply.
And flowing naturally from scientism is materialism, or you might hear it called naturalism. This is the belief that the physical stuff of the universe, matter and energy, that's it. That's the whole shebang. It's a philosophy of nothing but. So humans are seen as nothing but biological machines, and our consciousness is nothing but brain activity. The source we're looking at identifies this as a really foundational assumption in Tyson's worldview. So now that we have those two big isms down, let's see how they actually play out. Tyson publicly identifies as an agnostic, but the source asks a really interesting question. Does his public persona, his way of speaking, actually line up with that label? So if you ask Tyson, his official stance is pretty straightforward. I don't know. He frames this as the most intellectually honest position for any scientist to take. Without compelling, empirical, scientific-style evidence for a claim, the most rational thing to do is just to withhold your belief. Okay, but this is where the critique really digs in. The source argues that while the label says agnostic, the practice is actually functional atheism. What does that mean? It means that for all practical purposes, Tyson's worldview operates as if God does not exist. The analysis basically says his assumptions and his rhetoric are in practice pretty much indistinguishable from an atheist's.
So you might be asking, how did they make that claim? Well, the source points to some very specific communication tactics, like the ones you see here. It argues that by using tools like sarcasm, or by only focusing on really weak or strawman religious arguments, or framing God as just a placeholder for scientific ignorance, the God of the gaps, Tyson creates this overall impression that religious belief just isn't worthy of serious intellectual thought.
And that whole idea brings us full circle, right back to scientism itself. The source argues that this worldview actually has some pretty deep internal flaws. So let's take a look at the logical critique it lays out.
So the core idea of strong scientism is pretty simple. We should only believe things that can be proven by science. On the surface, it sounds rigorous, right? It sounds, scientific. But wait a minute, here's the kicker. Think about it. Can you prove the statement, we should only believe what can be scientifically proven, using the scientific method? No, you can't. You can't put that claim in a test tube or observe it under a microscope. It's a philosophical statement about science, not a finding of science. And according to the source, this makes scientism a self-refuting philosophy. Its own central belief fails its own test for what's true. Okay, so if scientism kind of eats its own tail, what about its philosophical buddy, materialism? The source argues that a purely materialist worldview really struggles to explain some of the biggest, most profound things about our reality. Let's look at what it calls the hard problems. Let's start with a big one, consciousness. We know our brain activity is linked to our thoughts, our feelings, but why?
Why do physical processes like neurons firing in our brain create the rich, subjective, first-person experience of being you? Materialism can describe the mechanics of the brain, sure, but the source argues it just can't explain the experience itself, what philosophers call the hard problem.
All right, next up is the origin of life itself. I mean, the leap from non-living chemicals to the very first living cell, with its mind-bogglingly complex, information-packed DNA code. That is a massive hurdle. The source argues that just saying this happened because of purely unguided random processes really strains belief, especially when you consider the sheer amount of specific functional information involved.
And then there's this, the fine-tuning of the entire universe. Physicists have discovered that the fundamental constants of nature, things like the strength of gravity or the mass of an electron, are balanced on an absolute razor's edge. If any of them were even a tiny bit different, life as we know it would be totally impossible. So why is our universe so perfectly calibrated for us to exist?
And this really boils down to two completely different ways of looking at it. On the one hand, you have a materialist explanation, the multiverse. The idea is that there are maybe infinite universes out there, and of course, we'd find ourselves in one that can support life. We just got lucky. And on the other hand, you have a theistic explanation, intelligent design. The idea that the universe was deliberately and purposefully calibrated by a creator for life to exist. So this all leads to the final piece of the argument. The source basically concludes that this worldview, this mix of scientism and functional atheism is, in the end, philosophically inconsistent.
You see, the analysis basically says that while being agnostic sounds like a neutral, hands-off position, Tyson's version isn't. By actively arguing against the rationality of belief, it stops being a neutral, I don't know. It becomes a positive claim, a claim that there aren't good enough reasons for belief, and that claim carries its own burden of proof. It has to justify itself, especially its very narrow definition of what even counts as evidence.
And it all comes back to that old saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The source argues that demanding purely scientific physical evidence for a being that is, by definition, non-material and outside of nature, well, that's a fundamental category error. It's like using a metal detector to search for the feeling of love. You're just using the wrong tool for the job. The fact that you don't get a signal doesn't prove a thing.
And so that leaves us with this one final, really powerful question to think about. Is science our most powerful tool for investigating the physical universe? Absolutely, no question. But is the physical universe all there is? Is science the definition of reality itself? That's not a scientific question, it's a philosophical one. And according to the source, how you answer it, well, that changes everything.